Good morning and welcome to the Forum at St. Bart's. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here, and it is my delight to welcome you to this conversation about polarization in our society, a topic that couldn't be more timely. We are very honored this morning to be joined by Peter Coleman, who is Professor of Psychology and Education at Columbia University, where he holds a joint appointment at Teachers College and the Earth Institute. He is the director of the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution, the founding director of the Institute for Psychological Science and Practice, and the executive director of Columbia's Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity. He's also the author of the forthcoming book, The Way Out: How to Overcome Toxic Polarization, about which we'll be speaking today. And we're grateful to St. Bart's vestry member and former colleague of Professor Coleman's, Peter Domenico, for making the connection and encouraging Professor Coleman to be here today. Thanks so much for taking your time to be with us today, Professor Coleman.
My pleasure, Peter. I'm glad we're all named Peter. That somehow seems meaningful.
So many Peters.
Right.
So I think you're going to share a few slides and then we'll have a chance for discussion at the end.
Yeah, I thought I'd provide some context to how I think about this and what I think is useful to know. So we did send out a note, which is an open letter. So I've been asked over the past month or so to generate some science-based insights for the Biden administration on what they might do to begin to mitigate the toxic polarization that we have. And so what we sent out to the community was, an open letter that I'm attempting to publish currently in Science, which lays out some of the main principles. But I thought I'd give you a little context to what it is. And part of the context, as you may be aware, is this is the front page in the New York Times today, which is that there is violence. There has been increasing violence, street violence between Trump supporters and, people that don't support Trump or people that, believe in the electoral system. And the violence started to spike again last night. And this is something of major concern. And it's, what I'm clear about in the letter and in general is that this is not just Trump. This is, decades of an increasing level of political, geographic polarization where we've sort of sorted into these different camps and have, in some ways, very different realities. And so that's what, I've written this book to think about what we can do. There's a lot of, I think, fantastic analysis of the problem of polarization, but there's less offered, I think, in terms of remedies. And so this book that's coming out on June 1st is my attempt to provide stories about the science on what to do and how to get out. And it was inspired by, I was approached several years ago by this group that is doing something called Germany Talks or My Country Talks. It's based out of Die Zeit, which is a periodical in Germany, but they have a cluster of people that they work with, which are other media organizations across Europe and to some degree across the world. And what they do is they ask people to go online, identify an issue that they feel strongly about, and whether they're sort of pro or con on that issue, and then they match them with someone in their community and ask them to go off and have a conversation. And they're doing this today. I was just online with them earlier this morning, sort of teeing that off. And most of the time, those kinds of conversations about political differences can be useful, just depending on how deep the differences are, how meaningful they are, and how the conversations proceed. But the story that was told to me by my colleague Bastian Berbner, who is one of the journalists that covers this, was about bringing a Trump supporter and an anti-Trumper together right after the elections. Actually, it was in 2017 that they came together, and initially the conversation went well. He grew to care for both of them, and that's why he brought them together. But as soon as the topic of Colin Kaepernick was introduced, it exploded, it became heated, they had to separate, and they never agreed to come back together again. And so the message to this, that this shares for me, is that this is not a problem necessarily that we can talk our way out of. I think important, respectful conversations are critical and useful, but they're insufficient to the problem of polarization, because it's a long-term problem. By some measures, this is a 50-year trajectory of escalating polarization and partisan enmity, and this is Pew research of citizens and research of our political leaders and their voting behaviors and their rhetoric and vitriol. So there's a long trajectory that we're in, which is an increasing trajectory. And the sources are complicated. It's not, it's just about one thing. It's not just about Trump. It's not just about the media. And in fact, if you read about what is behind this, there are a variety of things that people talk about: sensitivity, differences in sensitivity, brain sensitivity to threat of like red and blue Americans, and differences in ethnocentrism and authoritarianism. And, there are a lot of sort of psychological explanations, but there are also many, structural explanations or theories behind this, which contribute to it. So there is a lot happening. There are many forces happening with us psychologically, socially, and structurally in our nation that perpetuate this. And none of these explains the trajectory that we're on. It's more important, I think, to understand that it's how these things start to feed each other, the kind of dynamics that can take place over time, and supporting as a negative attitude affects what we view in the media, what we're comfortable. It shapes our neural pathways, which makes it harder to process just different information. So these are dynamics where things are kind of feeding each other. And as we started to study this and found all these sources, we started to realize that to some degree we're in this sort of superstorm of polarization, where there are structures, cognitive, neural structures, psychological structures, relational habits and norms that are structures, community structures, media, our political system, that feed each other and feed this pull towards more and more extreme pulls. So it creates this landscape for our life that really attracts us into toxic forms of division and hate. And again, as I said, this has been well documented for decades, that this has been increasing and growing, but the adverse consequences of it just become much more apparent when, in times like this, when we can't mobilize around a common threat like COVID, or like an economic crisis, we can't mobilize sufficiently to do that, to address those challenges. And so it is what I call a problem of the first order. It impairs our capacity as a nation to be resilient and respond to many of the challenges that we face. But I also think that this particular time brings some hope, which is that there are certain conditions where these kinds of long-term patterns, societal level patterns, do change. And we happen to have many of those conditions. So one is, you need to have a sufficient base in the population that is miserable. And the good news is we are. There's a study by a group called More in Common, and what they found is that something like 90% of Americans in the middle feel exhausted, spent, fed up, really looking for compromise, looking for an alternative. So there is a sense of misery. And again, this research comes out of usually nations that are at conflict or civil wars, where you have, acute violence, and it's really that kind of exhaustion that is a necessary condition for radical change. And instability. When there is considerable instability, it does start to shake up some of these cognitive structures, some of these relational structures. And it doesn't guarantee, that kind of instability doesn't guarantee change, but it is the kind of condition that would allow us to have change. But ultimately, what people need, if they feel fed up, if they feel destabilized and ready for a change, is they need to have some clear sense of a feasible way out. What can we do? And so that's why I wrote this book, is to try to articulate the conditions under which people actually can see a way out and will take advantage of it. And so what I did in this Biden memo is summarize some of the proposals that I had been offering to the transition team on. I've been working, talking to the transition team through Tim Schreiber and his group Unite. This is a relatively new group that was founded about 1.5 years ago that is attempting to address polarization. So I've been in conversation with them for over 1 year, and they were contacted by Bruce Reed, who's a former chief of staff of Biden, to start to feed ideas to their transition team and ultimately to the administration about the kinds of policies or approaches to governing that might be helpful. And so that's what this series was. Part of what it argues is that we can't have business as usual, leadership as usual, politics as usual, that what you see in the research is when sort of unsocialized leaders come in, leaders with a different point of view on the problem. They see it differently, they take it up differently. And so that's part of what I argue for. You also need to communicate explicitly to the American public what the goal is. And part of what I argue is that, I commend the Biden administration for, positioning themselves as valuing healing the soul of America, bringing people together, uniting America. But at a stage like this, there are so many people that are so angry and so involved in the fight that the idea of healing and uniting is so off-putting to many. However, understanding the toxicity of this division and the impact it has on our own personal health and our families and communities scaling up, and our inability to function as a nation, that is a mobilizing frame. And so my recommendation to them is that they focus on the need for us to detox as a nation. Eventually we can move into tolerance, maybe unity, reconciliation, those kinds of conversations. But if you do that too soon, you really grow resistance. I also talk about the need for radical listening. I was listening to a podcast that Barack Obama was on yesterday, and he mentioned doing this when he was first a community organizer. He was told by a mentor that the first thing you do is you don't talk to people, you just listen. He said he spent his first month in the communities just listening to people about their challenges and about their recommendations for remedies. And so that's what I've argued to the Biden administration, is the need to mobilize that and to use all of the sort of tools that we have and the community groups that we have in order to really start to listen. Part of the reason behind that is because what research tells us is that people in positions of low power are much more responsive to attitude change if they feel heard and responded to. So some kind of radical listening tour. And then ultimately the main pitch I make is that this is not something that the Biden administration can do unilaterally. It's something that what they should do is recognize that there are thousands of groups across the country, either community-based groups or groups within sectors like journalism and education, and environment and politics, who are bridge builders and are informed about this, know the conditions under which this works. And so it really is identifying what we call positive deviance, identifying those groups and individuals and societies that are already doing this work and seeking to kind of bolster that immune system that is existing, as opposed to proposing new things, really support and encourage what exists. And that should ultimately, I think, culminate in the declaration of a national strategy. And finally, the case I make is the importance of Biden himself and his staff modeling decency, modeling constructive dialogue, and modeling the possibility of change. That's another thing from research that we found in Israel-Palestine. If people believe fundamentally that you don't change, the others don't change, the situation will never change, then in fact it doesn't, because you disengage or you engage in a more contentious way. If you believe that people can change, situations can change, then we engage in a fundamentally different way. And so Biden modeling this and encouraging his choices for his cabinet or other high positions to model this for the public is, I think, highly beneficial, not just symbolic, but meaningful in terms of its inspiration of hope for a lot of the nation. So I will stop the slides there. And Peter, I know that you either had some questions that you wanted to pose, or we can take some questions.
Excellent. Yes, if you have questions for Professor Coleman, please utilize the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. That's pthompson @stbarts.org. I think a sort of obvious question to begin is, what do you say to the folks who say, well, justice is more important than depolarization, that achieving justice is what we need to do, not achieve some kind of unity?
Well, again, I think both are obviously necessary, right? And I don't see them as mutually exclusive. How we achieve justice is important. And again, with such tribalism and such enmity, it's difficult to mobilize any, certainly, legislation that can, 90% of our public believe that there should be background checks on buying new guns. We can't get our politicians to come together sufficiently to address that. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that, but to really enact new policies, new legislation that is more fair and more just and more inclusive, we ultimately need to have enough of the middle that are willing to compromise and are willing to take these issues up in ways that are constructive and functional. So, again, I don't see them as mutually exclusive. And I do think that there are things that, I am a big supporter of, nonviolent civil disobedience and protest and pressure. I think pressure campaigns are critical and important, but I must stress nonviolence, because as soon as you tip into violence, you really lose the moral credibility that is necessary for that type of pressure to have an impact. So I agree completely that we need both, but ultimately we are in such a vitriolic place that we are in some ways in different realities. And I do want to say, as I mentioned about the My Country Talks piece, there's benefit in talking and conversation, but one of the most effective things that happens are when these groups, these community-based groups, begin in dialogue and find common ground within their group across these divides, and then they identify specific structural things that they can go after in their community that they're well positioned to do. Like in journalism, there's a group called Solutions Journalism, and Amanda Ripley wrote a piece a couple of years ago called Complicating the Narrative. And so journalists have been taking on the fact that how they do their reporting and how they're rewarded needs to change, because because of how they do that, they're instigating polarization and increasing polarization, as opposed to introducing more nuance into our understanding of the general public of these issues. So that is a critical step. It's not just about talk, it's also about action, but we have to come together in order to realize that action.
We have received several questions already about violence, and specifically you talk about the need to avoid violence, but what happens when violence has already broken out? What are strategies to kind of cool the violence down?
Well, of course, leadership matters, rhetoric matters. But given our current circumstances and given where we are, you do need to have security within communities that includes the police, but also goes beyond the police. So oftentimes in times of social unrest, again, mobilizing community-based groups that are good at preventing violence or intervening in violence. The interrupters is one, but there are many of these kind of community-based groups that are organized and can bolster and support police efforts to, secure community. So, I am all about nonviolence, because what I know is that when there is violence, that makes all of our problems much harder. That makes, the emotional context, the resentment, the need for retribution are powerful passions that can really derail us. And so we need to do everything we can to try to prevent that. But I do want to encourage, community leaders to not just look to the police, or worse yet, look to the military, but ultimately to look to our community conflict resolvers and peacemakers, of which there are many, and mobilize and support and encourage them in a preventative way.
So arguably, we're seeing right now not only polarization, but also factionalism, seeing, in the discussions over the president-elect's cabinet, they're different parties within the left that want different things, and no one seems to be able to be satisfied or coalesce around any specific one group of people. On the right, you see folks no longer satisfied with Fox News. It's not extreme enough. So we have Newsmax. Do you think that's a kind of accurate diagnosis of what's happening? And how does factionalism further complicate the issue of polarization?
I mean, it's an interesting dilemma, because on the one hand, what you're describing is democracy, right? That there are these different groups vying for positions, and there can be a healthy process inherent to that helps us ultimately move forward as a nation. But what you also see in war zones is that there is more and more factionalism as groups become more and more narrow and more extreme. And I think to some degree that's what we're seeing on the left and the right, on the extremes. The extremes these days have gained most of the attention, right? They're much more active in social media. They're much more active in various forms of media. And so they're in some ways driving the discourse. And we need to flip that. We need to, again, engage the middle, this growing middle that want an alternative way, provide them with the kind of support that they need so that they can kind of sort of capture that. But so, that would be my response.
There's been several questions about radical listening, and if you can talk a little bit more about that. How can radical listening work if both parties don't agree on the facts, if the facts themselves are up for dispute, and how do you kind of reconcile your belief that we can't talk ourselves out of any problem with the importance of radical listening?
Well, again, it depends on who's listening and how they listen, and whether or not there's kind of response and follow-up. I know, there is a process that's been used more frequently on canvassing, which is a process of in political canvassing, where political organizers will go into a community and attempt to sort of listen in order to engage people in dialogue, in order to ultimately sort of sway their opinions. I don't think that's the answer. I don't think we want to weaponize dialogue and weaponize listening as a way to influence people to do what we want them to do. I think what we need to do is post-election say, we're genuinely interested in the challenges that you're facing in your life and in remedies that you think would be helpful, remedies that would be helpful for the nation. And engage in those kinds of conversations. This is so radical listening. There's radical empathy, and there's a lot of utilization of that term. But radical listening is a process that is been found to be particularly effective, for example, in development work. So typically in development work, the international community defines the problem, provides a solution, and it's not sustainable. And that's an error that the international community has been making for decades. And what they found is that when you go into a community and you talk to parents about violence and their children and why they do what they do to keep them safe, you start to have a profoundly different understanding of the challenges that are faced, but why certain solutions locally work better than others. So it's a non-expert focused model, and it's very hard for most policymakers and leaders and decision makers to adopt it. But it is critical that, and ironically, to be honest with you, if you think about how Trump built his base of power, he did it through hiring 2 lawyers to listen to talk radio for 2 years and to identify the most contentious, heated issues that he could build his campaign around. So in some ways that was insightful, that you need to kind of go to communities, listen to communities, and find what's resonant. Now, of course, ultimately, I think Trump weaponized those concerns, and we're seeing the effects of that. There are different things you can do with people's concerns, and part of it, again, is also ask them for remedies that they think are useful. So it's not going to break through the challenges of the media system that we have and the different echo chambers that we have. That's a different kind of structural problem that we also need to take on. But simply the act of listening by the government, following through, and again, involving local community people that are much more trusted than the federal government in this process is critical as well, because part of it is trust. Obviously there's a wide swath of our country that does not trust the government, that does not trust certain types of media. And so you need to sort of find who are the people that they trust locally, and are there ways to work with them to change the conversations?
Can you talk a little bit more about the media? And it does seem like the media is incentivized to increase polarization rather than decrease it. How could that possibly be shifted?
Well, again, I think it's best shifted within the media. I do think that there are things that the federal government can do. The fairness doctrine, as you may be aware of, was a doctrine in place for many years. If you got an FCC license, you had to report on contentious issues and provide different points of view. And the Reagan administration ended that, and that created the kind of conditions under which you see much more opinion news and less, it used to be that the news, certainly the nightly news, was a loss leader. It cost media organizations to do the news. They didn't make any money on it. And then it was really for the greater good. It was for the community, right? It was sort of reporting on what was happening in our world. When it became a source of revenue, ironically, that was 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes was the news program that started to make a profit. And from that, the focus and the incentive structure of news changed, which is part of what's happening, but also the lack of sort of federal monitoring on what constitutes news versus entertainment has changed. So there can be things that the federal government can do, but I think the most important change will come from journalists. So I do recommend that people read this piece by Amanda Ripley called "Complicating the Narrative." She spent a year studying mediation and dialogue groups, and she came to our lab and participated and wrote this piece about what journalists can do in how they do their reporting that can help reintroduce nuance into complicated problems, because most of the things we're talking about are highly complicated. Immigration is an immensely complicated set of dilemmas, right? But when you oversimplify it, which is what journalists will tend to do, because if you get at the fight, if you get at the tension, you get more attention, you get more clicks, and you get supported. So what they're trying to do internally is really look at those incentive structures and how what they do inadvertently, oftentimes, how their reporting exacerbates the problem as opposed to reintroduces nuance and understanding. So I think that's where real change has to happen. There are things that the federal government can do, but I think it has to come from within the industry.
Can you talk a bit about the role religious communities can play? Have they been helpful in de-escalating polarization? Have they also contributed to escalating polarization?
Yes, both are true,
yeah.
Right? And again, religion, I think like anything else, can be weaponized and used against others. Or you can have examples of religious communities that are really the epitome of peacemakers. So I have a close colleague, Andrea Bartoli, who's a member of the Community of San Egidio, which is a Roman Catholic group founded a couple of decades ago. Mostly what they do is work around the world on poverty, right? Alleviating poverty. But because they're in many conflict zones, they're oftentimes sort of trusted sources, local sources. And because of that, they get involved usually very quietly in back channel negotiations and in bringing people together and in encouraging dialogue and ultimately negotiation. Currently, they have been making tremendous progress in South Sudan. Again, very quiet progress, but it had been real progress towards real negotiations around real peace processes and peace treaties, and they're nearing the achievement of an agreement. So again, these are local community-based people that are there usually doing good work, and they can be tremendous sources of unification, trust, sort of bartering or brokering trust between people who don't trust each other, if there is trust in them. So there are a tremendous resource. One of the points I make is the need to work with community groups, and many of them are religious service groups that see part of their mandate as building bridges. So I think that they're a critical infrastructure that can be used, but as we see, they can also be the source of vitriol and attack.
We talked about the news media. Can we talk a little bit about social media and the impact Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, has had on polarization?
Yeah, it's been huge, right? As you can imagine. I have a story to tell about that, which is about 2 years ago, I was invited via Twitter to a pop-up meeting by a kind of community organizing group, a very popular group. And they invited a group of us to come downtown for an hour to talk about, to address this question. How can we promote a healthy society through dialogue in social media, right? That was the kind of question that they wanted to have a conversation with. And what was interesting is that there were some of the big tech people were there. One of the founders of Facebook was there. So it was a really interesting group of people. But the question they pose is, what kind of dialogue should we have in order to have a healthy virtual society? And the question I asked was, what do you mean by dialogue? And there was silence. And I said, because most of us, when we say that, what we mean is debate. We mean that I'm going to listen to your argument, find the flaws, weaponize them, come in to win the game of debate, to show you that I'm right and you're wrong. And that's how we're socialized typically in this country. It's what we see on Law and Order. It's what we see in politics. It's what we learned in high school. I was trained as a debater in high school. It really is part of our DNA. And dialogue is a fundamentally different kind of process. Dialogue is a process where you actually learn. You learn about your own ambivalences and questions. You learn about the other's complexity. You learn about how complex these issues are. And so it's a very different kind of process, usually of sharing stories. So I told this to this group of media experts, and there was silence. And then this founder of Facebook said, oh, well, if that's dialogue, then there's no place on the internet where there's dialogue. He said, the only exception is Zoom, where you can actually have a dialogue. But he said, the major platforms are all about competition, social comparison, one-upping each other. And so, what he was, and there was general agreement to this, that basically the algorithms behind many of these systems are about competing and being contentious and attacking each other and weaponizing, information in order to prove the other wrong. And that there's much less space in the internet for discovery. So, there are two things that have to happen within social media. One is that they do have to come together around a set of norms that, norms and taboos about what people can and cannot do. Wikipedia has done this. Wikipedia has a set of criteria that if you want to stay engaged in Wikipedia, you have to follow that criteria. And those norms help it be a much more functional space for bringing nuance into issues. But they also have to look at the fact that their basic business model is about tapping into addictive things like competing with others. And that is a hard thing to move away from because it's so lucrative, but it is an essence of the problem.
Do you see regulation of social media as an important
I think it's going to be, I know that, there's been calls now to break up Facebook and because it is a growing monopoly. I think that's going to be a hard fight at this point because there's so much money. I mean, it's like fighting the drug cartels, there's so much money in that they can take the government to court forever and boondoggle a process. I do think it's ultimately will have to happen. And I do think given the reputation challenges that groups like Facebook have had because they've been weaponized for things like genocide in South Sudan and Myanmar, that they're to some degree open to, again, looking at their norms and then maybe starting to look at their financial structures. But I think that's going to be a tough fight.
We even have a question about C-SPAN. A curiosity about this, the impact of constantly being able to monitor the workings of our government and the effect that may have had on polarization.
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, again, I think that if people, C-SPAN doesn't go into their offices and hallways, right? C-SPAN is the public forum. And the public forum has always been a public forum. And to some degree, the public forum is a place of performance. And oftentimes in the past, politicians have understood that. They use it to send messages to their constituents and across the aisle, So I don't know if C-SPAN itself, because of the nature of what it covers, makes things any worse than, than the fact that these forums have been open to the public for, centuries. I do think that, the norms around politics itself have become, have degraded. And so you see more and more vitriol and attack and less of construction. And one of my theories behind that, which is not my theory alone, but is what I call the Newt Gingrich effect, which that when Newt Gingrich became the Speaker of the House, one of the first things he did was he shortened the work week, right? He moved it from 5 days to 3 days. And he said to his people, don't move here, stay home, stay in your state. You can raise more money there. And I don't want you interacting with the enemy, And what that removed was what we call cross-cutting structures. It removed the fact that families would move to Washington, D.C. Their children would go to school together and play Little League together and, go ice skating together. And they would grow up together. And that created a sense of trust and bond that then makes it much harder to vilify the other side, even if they have different positions than you on moral issues. So the lack of that kind of complex social structure that enforce these bonds is one of the structural components that has led to so much vitriol in our politicians, and now we can see that publicly. So to some degree, I think C-SPAN has had some impact, but not nearly as much as these other structural changes, I think.
We still have a few minutes for final questions, so feel free to send them in. You can use the live chat function on YouTube, comments function on Facebook, speaking of social media, and or you can just email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. I have to say, I don't think we've ever received as many questions as we've received for this forum. It's clearly tapping into to something that's on everyone's minds. We've received several questions about personal relationships. You've talked about some strategies on the societal level, but a lot of folks are wondering, how do I talk to my family members? How do I talk to my colleagues? How do I talk to my friends? The conversation just seems to shut down. Do you have any recommendations on a one-to-one level?
Yeah, I do. I mean, again, when you have the conversation matters, people get anxious because at Thanksgiving, after a meal and drinking some wine and being tired, they get into topics that are incendiary, and that's not a great time to do that. So my recommendation is if you want to have these conversations with colleagues, that you really consider when to do them, right? That you know that how you initiate those conversations really makes a big difference. What we find from the study of these difficult conversations is how they begin, how you come out of the gate, whether you come out of the gate sort of sharing what's important to you in a way that invites the other to share what's important to them, or whether you come out of the gate with an attack, will, move you in very different directions. So be mindful of how you feel as you get into it, how you start the conversation, how you frame the conversation. Sometimes it's helpful even to kind of agree on how should we have this conversation. I know you have different points of view. I really am interested in learning about that. Do you mind telling me for a while why this is important to you? And then I'd like the opportunity to talk as well and tell you my story. So the sort of sharing of stories is one way to go after it. And the only other thing I'll say is, relationships that have been going on for a while have what we call emotional reservoirs. You have a reservoir of positivity and trust for some people, and other people you don't. And so being mindful of that, because if you're going into a conversation with an uncle that you always get into conflict with and you always get stuck with, and you're fed up with, this is going to move you into that direction, right? The odds are, there are too many things pulling you into that space. So you should be mindful of what is the nature of your relationship as you go into this conversation. And is it possible to have one where you can both learn?
You write in your open letter to Biden about the importance of new leadership. Old leadership becomes invested in what once was, and it's hard for them to think in new ways about our country's situation. Yet one person pointed out it's not as if the president-elect is necessarily a new leader. He's been around Washington a long time, and you've also sort of, it seems like you're sort of wistfully looking back to an era in which there was a kind of an establishment Washington, and folks were a little entrenched. So can you talk about that kind of tension in your thinking?
Yeah, well, again, what that idea comes from is, when institutions and communities see real transformational change, it usually comes because there is some kind of unsocialized leader that comes in. And, again, both Trump, who is, I would say, came in as an unsocialized leader in terms of politics, but also Bernie Sanders, was in some ways an outsider who came in with a radically different view of what the challenges were and proposals for what the challenges were. And so, Biden can do this. It's interesting because I think, Biden is older. He's been in politics for a long time. Yes, he has vested interests, but he's also a person that has built his career and his reputation on bipartisanship, on reaching out to people, on connecting with people, on liking people and wanting them to care for him. So he does have a certain ethos that could allow him to be in a position where he takes this up. But I think you need to demonstrate that what you plan to do is radically different from what you've done in the past. And I think part of what we've seen an increase on is politics over people, right? Politics over unity. It's really not about the common good in the community. It's really about holding on to power. And he would have to publicly demonstrate how he will work against that and commit to it publicly and follow through with it. And so some of, a couple of the recommendations that were in that letter and that I've been talking to them about is how do you operationalize that? How do you really get your people, your leaders that you're bringing on to pledge to work in a different way? What does that look like? If you're the Secretary of Defense or, housing and urban development, what are the practices you do that really help start to understand those that feel disenfranchised and, reach out to them and not vilify or alienate them?
So we're coming close to the end of our time together. A final question relates to generational differences. One person says, what do we do with all these younger folks that are looking only to social media and don't see any value in the mainstream? I've also heard folks my age say, what are we going to do about all these older folks? who are sitting at home and just watching Fox News. So how do different generations approach polarization and depolarization differently?
It's a great question. And I think, I think there's a lot of promise in that. I mean, look, social media is brand new. Like Facebook is new. It's a relatively new phenomenon, and it's evolving and changing quickly. And young people's engagement in that and other platforms, I think, are promising, because ultimately they will need to create, norms around the public square that are acceptable, that are open and inclusive, but are also acceptable and sufficiently tolerant. They will need to do that if these things will survive. And I think that they can be a tremendous opportunity for creating better venues for communication. Certainly better than as I described, having the algorithms pit us against each other. They need to sort of, and again, they're the market. They're the market that Zuckerberg is seeking, And so in many ways, they have a lot of power and authority in shaping what those things are and aren't. And so I'm encouraged by that. And, again, I think that they should engage with, some of us older folks that are still reading the New York Times as a, as a physical entity. But I think that there's a lot of possibility there, and there's a lot of power in that group to shape this in ways that are more functional for our democracy and healthier. And again, I think Wikipedia is a good example of that, because they learned how to build infrastructure where you don't get as much misinformation and vitriol. And you can, in fact, there's research on Wikipedia that shows that the more polarized the contributors are, as long as they play within the rules of Wikipedia, the better the content, the more sophisticated and the better the content. So that's the dilemma, right? You need to have both those kind of guardrails, and you need to have these different points of view, which again is the essence of democracy.
Well, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. This has been such a treat this morning. This is so needed, I think, and I can feel that from all the folks writing in this conversation. So you have a built-in audience here for your book that's coming out in a few months. Thank you so much for taking this time to be with us. Do you have any parting words of wisdom for us?
Well, no, I get, thank you, Peter. Thank you for inviting me. I would be happy to come back and to continue the conversation. This is a problem that's been a long time coming and growing. And there are not quick fixes to this and quick solutions. This does require us to stay in conversation, particularly with people that differ from us. There's one thing, a man named Alan Jacobs, who wrote a book called How to Think. He's a teacher. And what he said is, you need to find the best people who think differently from you and engage with them. And that might be in your community, and that might be in the media. But it means that you don't have to listen to the insane ones. You need to find people that you think are thoughtful and well-intentioned, and engage with them, follow them, communicate with them, speak with them. That's how we stay more informed, and I think that will lead to a more promising future.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Coleman. Thank you all for watching. Please join us for worship if you can at 11 a.m.